Welcome to Scary Stories, real or written. Each of the following tales could be true or completely made up. Can you tell which is which? Let's begin. About 10 years ago, my wife and I bought a nice, very peaceful few acres of land tucked deep in the hills near a tiny town called Todd. If you've never heard of Todd, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. Todd, North Carolina, isn't much more than a single gas station, a general store that still sells glass bottle sodas, and a scattering of houses hidden deep amongst the hills and ridges. It's pure, quiet country, the kind of place where you can actually clearly see the stars at night, and the only noises you hear are the sounds of nature. No sirens, no noisy neighbors, just the birds and the bugs, and maybe the occasional sound of a deer making its way through the shrubbery. True peace, and we bought that land because that's all we wanted. My wife and I lived a couple hours away, near the city, and I'd been working long hours for years. Both of us were tired of noise, traffic, and neighbors. So that little piece of uninhabited mountain land was designated to be our escape from the noise. Fresh air, freedom, and most of all, personal space. At the time, there was nothing on it but trees and a rough dirt road that wound its way up to a small clearing. We decided we'd go up one weekend, set up camp, and spend our first night under the stars on our own land. It was early autumn, still warm in the day, but the evenings had that crisp chill that makes you crave a campfire. We packed up our camper with our clothes, bathroom supplies, a cooler full of food, and even a small grill, and headed off to Todd. Upon arrival, after taking a bit of a break, we spent most of the day just exploring and familiarizing ourselves with the land. I remember saying how quiet it was out there, how you could actually hear the leaves rustling across the ground when the wind picked up enough. By sunset, we'd settled in near the edge of the clearing. My wife was slicing vegetables, and I was poking at the grill, trying to get the flame just right. Everything felt perfect. Then the woods went still. Not all at once, but piece by piece. The crickets stopped. The birds fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, and then with it, the leaves stopped rustling. And that's when I heard faint, rhythmic voices. The sound began coming from deeper in the trees, downhill from where we were. My first thought was that it might be some other campers who didn't know someone now owns the land, or maybe a group of kids partying somewhere nearby. But as I listened, I realized they weren't talking, they were chanting. Low, steady, and all in unison. I turned down the lantern light until it was barely aglow and motioned for my wife to keep quiet. The sound grew clearer. It wasn't English, or at least not any English I recognized. There were no clear words, just a pattern, a sound that rose and fell, over and over, almost musical. Then, after a couple minutes of watching and listening, we saw them. Moving through the trees, mostly single file, aside from the occasional straggler on one side or the other, was a line of figures. Women, dozens of them. Most were young adult and middle-aged, with long, wild hair. Others older, bent slightly, steadying themselves with sticks. And some of them, my goodness, were basically children. And every single one of them was naked. They moved in silence, except for that chant, all of them stepping in time. Their skin looked pale in the moonlight, almost silvery. They didn't seem to see us, or maybe they didn't care. They just kept walking, eyes forward, moving through the trees like they'd done it 100 times before. My wife's hand found mine. Her nails dug into my skin, but I couldn't look away. The chant grew louder as they drew closer, then started to fade again as the procession moved past us. The rhythm was hypnotic. I could almost feel it in my chest, vibrating like the heartbeat of the forest itself. And, just as suddenly as it had began, it was gone. The last of them disappeared into the darkness. The woods were silent again, completely still, like nothing had ever happened. We sat frozen, staring into the trees for what felt like forever. I don't know how long we stayed that way before either of us finally spoke. "What was that?" my wife whispered. I didn't have an answer. I don't think I breathed for the rest of the night. Every time a twig cracked or an owl hooted, my heart jumped into my throat. When morning finally came, the sunlight felt entirely too bright, harsh after the night before. I decided to walk down the path where they'd come from, just to make sure it hadn't all been in my head. There were footprints, dozens of them, small, large, deep in the damp soil, all barefoot. They followed the same trail downhill for about a quarter mile until they reached the creek bed. Then they just stopped. No prints crossing the water, no signs of where they'd gone, just vanished. That day, we packed up early. Neither of us said it, but we both felt the same thing. Whatever that was, we didn't want to see it again. We didn't go back for a long time, months actually. But once we did go back, we were reminded of the beauty and peace of the property and began coming back again fairly regularly. So what if our very first visit was a weird one? Still, every now and then, I'll catch my wife looking toward the woods like she's listening for something. I've gone out there alone a few times since, just to see what, if anything, I could find. But the only time I ever found evidence of anything ever happening at all was last year, right after Halloween. I went to cut down a fallen tree near that old trail. As I walked past the creek bed, I saw something half buried in the mud. A small bundle of dried herbs tied together with red twine. It looked fresh. I left it right where it was. When I got home that night, my wife asked where I'd been. Before I could answer, she said, "I thought I heard that singing again." I didn't tell her where I was. I still hear things sometimes when the wind comes down from the hills. Soft, distant, almost like a hum. I tell myself it's just the wind moving through the trees. But deep down, I'm not so sure. I grew up in Adams, Tennessee, a small town with just a few hundred people, give or take. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's truck, and you can tell which dogs belong to who just by the way they bark. And if you grow up in Adams, there's one story you can't escape. The story of the Bell Witch. I've heard about it my whole life. The Bell Witch story is about a female spirit that tormented a family back in the early 1800s. Some say she was a witch. Others say she was the devil herself. As far as most of the world is concerned, her wicked spirit has since moved on. But as far as most folks around here are concerned, they'll tell you she never left. Despite having heard about it my whole life, I've personally never thought much of it. But a few years ago, something happened out near the old infamous Bell property, and I can't explain it to this day. The trouble started when a developer from Nashville bought a big piece of land outside town, land that used to belong to the Bell family generations ago. He said he wanted to modernize Adams, build a few rental cabins, maybe even a distillery. The locals weren't happy, but money talks, and pretty soon there were bulldozers clearing the edge of the woods near the Bell Witch Cave. That's when weird things started happening. At first, it was small stuff. Farmers waking up to find their livestock restless, staring at nothing. Tools going missing. People said they'd hear a woman singing, way off in the trees, but the sound would vanish the second you tried to follow it. I worked maintenance for the county, and one night I was out fixing a downed power line not far from the old Bell property. It was after midnight, so the darkness was no joke, and I would have felt completely isolated had it not been for the cicadas screaming. My flashlight kept flickering, and I remember wishing I'd brought some spare batteries, because if this flashlight dies, I might end up lost in the night forever. But thankfully, the flashlight decided to hang in there long enough for me to finish doing all of what I needed to do. As I was packing up, I heard something. A woman's voice, faint, just over the hill. It sounded like she was calling for help. Now, I've got a wife and daughter at home, so I don't ignore a cry like that. I grabbed my light and started toward the sound. "Hello?" I called out. No answer, just the wind rustling the tall grass. Then I heard it again, closer this time. "Help me!" It was low and broken, like someone struggling to breathe. I followed the sound down toward the creek, and that's when my flashlight finally went dead completely. Pitch black. Ah, shit. The air turned cold. Not cool, cold. As if the season randomly decided to shift from early fall to middle of winter. And then I heard her, right behind me. A woman's voice, clear as if she were whispering, leaning close to my ear. "Go home." I spun around so fast I nearly tripped, shining my phone flashlight in every direction. Nothing, not even a footprint in the mud. But the smell, it was like burnt wood and wet earth. I finally managed to make my way to my truck and head back home. But once I got home, I didn't sleep much that night. A few days later, the developer's crew packed up early. One of his men, a guy named John, came into town for a drink and told everyone he was done working out there. Said something had messed with his truck. When people pressed him, he looked pale. Said he'd parked near the tree line that morning, and when he went back for his keys, the truck was gone. They found it 2 miles away, deep in the woods, nose down in a creek. No tire tracks, no sign it had been driven. He swore he'd left it in park. The next week, the developer himself came down to check things out. He said the town was just full of superstitions and that he wasn't going to let some old ghost story ruin his plans. He stayed overnight in a camper near the work site, but by morning, he was gone. They found him 2 days later, wandering barefoot on the highway, clothes torn, no memory of how he had gotten there. He told police he'd woken up to a woman standing at the foot of his bed. He couldn't see her face, but her hair hung long and black, and she kept repeating the same words over and over. "You should have listened." After that, every worker quit. The property went quiet. Now, here's where it gets strange. About a month later, my daughter, she's 9, came into the kitchen early one morning holding one of her sketchbooks. She said she'd had a dream about a lady in the woods who told her to draw a cave. I figured she'd overheard one of us talking about the Bell Witch, so I just smiled and told her it looked great. But when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. The drawing was a perfect outline of the Bell Witch Cave, right down to the crooked entrance and the bend in the creek beside of it. I asked her how she knew what it looked like. She just said, "The lady showed me." I drove out there that afternoon just to prove to myself that nothing weird was going on. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no bugs, nothing. Now, if you know anything at all about the Appalachians, you know if the forest suddenly becomes dead silent, it's never because of anything good. But, nevertheless, I exited the truck and made my way toward the cave entrance. Sitting right in the dirt, about 5 foot from the cave, was a brand new construction helmet. The kind the crew had been wearing. Inside the helmet, written in black marker, were 3 words. "I warned you." I left right then. Didn't look back. It's been 2 years now. The developer sold the land, and the forest started to grow back. No one's tried building there since. But sometimes, on foggy nights when the wind's blowing in just right, I swear you can still hear a woman singing out there. Not sad, not angry, just watching. People say the Bell Witch was buried long ago, but I don't think spirits like hers ever die. They just wait. So, let's see how well you did tonight. Let's talk about our first story, where the couple goes camping on their own land for the sake of some peace and quiet, only to be interrupted not long after by an army of chanting naked women. Well, it might seem a bit shocking, but that story was completely true in every aspect. This particular incident actually happened to one of my husband's work friends, and they allowed me to share their story. Now, for our second story, where the construction crew tries to renovate a section of property with some legendary backstory, only to have those plans completely tampered with to the point of where the crew eventually surrendered. That story was technically nothing but written fiction, but it is a fictional, modernized tale regarding the real legend about the Bell Witch from Adams, Tennessee. So, how did you do? Did you guess either story right? Let me know in the comments how well you did and whether you enjoyed this week's stories. You can also leave suggestions for topics on future videos if you wish. And, last but not least, if you would love to submit a story of your own for a future video, click on the Google form link in the channel description or the video description. I look forward to hearing from you and reading your stories, and I hope you look forward to hearing from me again next week.